You're listening to the Dead Presidents Podcast, and this is the top 5 non-consecutive term campaigns.
5, we're about to take a dive. 4, in the presidential lore. 3, who will the top 5 be? 2, we're about to tell you. 1, let's go without a gun.
Hello and welcome to the Dead Presidents Podcast. Already. Hello and welcome to the Dead Presidents Podcast. I'm Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
And I'm James J. Hamilton.
And we're here with another exciting top 5.
That's right, non-consecutive term campaigns, former presidents, trying to come out of retirement and take another shot at the White House.
That's just it.
A handful have tried, not many have succeeded. We're going to learn all about it.
That's right. Let's begin with number 5, Martin Van Buren, 1844.
That's right, Martin Van Buren rose to power as the architect of the New York Democratic Party machine and the National Democratic Party organization behind Andrew Jackson's two-term presidency. He became Jackson's presidential successor after coasting to victory in 1836 against a divided Whig party. However, the Panic of 1837 left Van Buren's presidency mired in economic stagnation. In 1840, the Whig Party was united, energized, and well-organized after lifting pages from Van Buren's own organizational playbook. Whig nominee William Henry Harrison and his running mate John Tyler triumphed in the general election, and Van Buren went home to New York.
That's right, but Whig unity isn't going to last, as Harrison died 31 days into his term, and Tyler, a former Democrat, refused to follow the lead of his Whig cabinet and was soon expelled from the party. Van Buren began receiving letters from leading Democrats encouraging him to run for president again. In 1842, he traveled throughout the U.S., and his warm reception confirmed his intent to seek the 1844 Democratic nomination. His longtime rival, Arch-Southerner John C. Calhoun, had his own eye on the nomination, but abandoned his efforts as Van Buren solidified support. It seemed like Van Buren would coast to the nomination, and he informed Jackson that he expected the Democratic Convention to be, quote, very harmonious.
Well, in early 1844, however, Democratic harmony was threatened by the reemergence of a divisive issue, Texas annexation. In 1837, while Van Buren was president, the Republic of Texas had asked the U.S. for annexation. Van Buren indicated the U.S. would have to reach a diplomatic accord with Mexico, which did not recognize Texas independence. Texas subsequently withdrew its annexation request, and the issue returned to the back burner. However, President Tyler had engaged in secret talks with Texas, and in March 1844 signed an annexation treaty. Tyler named Calhoun as Secretary of State to take charge of the issue, and Jackson himself announced his support for annexation.
Now, despite being warned that he would lose the nomination if he opposed annexation, Van Buren came out against it. Many Northerners opposed annexation, particularly because they didn't want to add another slave state to the Union. Calhoun openly argued that annexing Texas was about defending the institution of slavery. Van Buren did not want to expand slavery, and he felt Northern Democrats had already made great sacrifices backing policies favored by Southern Democrats, especially low tariffs and Indian removal. Van Buren drew the line on Texas annexation, arguing it meant war with Mexico, and saying he would follow, quote, the path of duty to oppose it. Henry Clay, the presumptive Whig nominee, came out against annexation at the same time.
Now, while Van Buren had already had support pledged from a majority of Democratic Convention delegates, the convention's rules required support from 2/3 of the delegates to win the nomination. Other Democratic hopefuls included former Michigan Governor Lewis Cass and Van Buren's former Vice President Richard Mentor Johnson. Van Buren led the convention on the early ballots, but his opposition to annexation meant that he could not reach the 2/3 threshold, and his nomination was dead in the water. On the 8th convention ballot, New Hampshire voted for James K. Polk, the former House Speaker and Tennessee governor who had supported Van Buren with the hope of becoming his vice president. Polk was a Jackson protege and ardent annexationist, but his loyalty to Van Buren's candidacy helped make him a palatable option for Van Buren supporters. On the 9th convention ballot, Van Buren's campaign manager tearfully withdrew his candidacy, and support cascaded toward Polk, who won the nomination as a dark horse compromise candidate. Despite the disappointment among his supporters, Van Buren ensured that the New York Democratic machine lined up behind Polk in the general election. A huge swing state, New York went for Polk by a mere 5,000 votes and made the decisive difference in his narrow victory over Henry Clay.
We also got an honorable mention for Martin Van Buren in 1848. Now, Van Buren had a falling out with Polk when the new president declined to appoint Van Buren's preferred cabinet choices. Polk completed the annexation of Texas and, after winning the ensuing Mexican-American War, gained a vast swath of territory, including California, New Mexico, and Arizona. Freed from electoral ambitions, Van Buren adopted a more openly anti-slavery position. He supported the Wilmot Proviso, an unsuccessful proposal to ban slavery in the newly acquired territory. Van Buren's anti-slavery stance earned him support from Northern Democrats and abolitionist Whigs. The slavery issue split the New York Democratic Party, which divided into factions, with Van Buren joining the anti-slavery Barn Burners. Led by Van Buren's son John, the Barn Burners bolted from the 1848 Democratic National Convention and joined forces with other anti-slavery factions to form the Free Soil Party.
That's right, and Van Buren wrote a letter stating that he did not want the Free Soil Party's presidential nomination, but he argued in favor of its principles, saying the Founding Fathers had understood the inconsistency between slavery and the principles of the Revolution, and since the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, the Founders had opposed the expansion of slavery into federal territories. The Free Soil Party ignored Van Buren's refusal and unanimously nominated him as its presidential candidate, with Charles Francis Adams, son of JQA, as his running mate.
After a career built on party loyalty, Van Buren accepted a third-party nomination for president. He believed that, quote, the long-term welfare of the Democratic Party and the nation required that the Democratic Party shed its Calhounite influence even at the cost of losing an election or two. A Calhoun ally called Van Buren's message, quote, the fierce war cry of a new and formidable party, led by a bold, unscrupulous, and vindictive demagogue. Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, a future Republican senator, accepted Van Buren as the Free Soil standard-bearer, saying, quote, with him, we can break the slave power. That is our first aim.
Well, the Free Soil ticket did not win widespread support. Though Democrats and Whigs both nominated slave owners for president, most Northern Democrats and Northern Whigs maintained regular party loyalty. Van Buren didn't win any states, but he received 10% of the popular vote and may have siphoned enough votes away from the Democrat Lewis Cass to tip the election in favor of Whig Zachary Taylor. Once again, New York's electoral votes were decisive. But where Polk had won New York with Van Buren's support, Cass finished in third place with only 25% of the vote, behind 48% for Taylor and 26% for Van Buren. The Free Soil Party would later merge with the new Republican Party. Van Buren returned to the Democratic fold, but he deplored the Democratic Party's continued appeasement of its Southern pro-slavery wing. He stayed out of electoral politics after 1848, but he publicly supported the Union cause during the Civil War until his death in 1862.
And that's going to bring us to the top 5 non-consecutive term campaigns.
Number 4.
Ulysses S. Grant, 1880. Ulysses S. Grant looked forward to leaving office at the end of his second term. However, some urged him to seek a third term, including his wife Julia and the stalwart Republican faction led by New York Senator Roscoe Conkling. The stalwarts epitomized the spoils system of political machine patronage, a system which had been abused by many Grant associates, leading to a plethora of corruption scandals that plagued his administration. Grant squashed talk of a third term, telling Julia, quote, I do not want to be here for another 4 years. I do not think I could stand it. Republican nominee Rutherford B. Hayes would win the 1876 election, and when Grant handed over the reins, he said he, quote, felt like a boy getting out of school.
Well, while Grant and his wife went on a 2.5-year world tour, the stalwarts clashed with Hayes over his attempts at civil service reform, and Conkling plotted Grant's return to the White House in 1880. Grant's son later wrote, quote, while father was abroad, his political friends arranged that he should try again for the third term, and had gone so far in their arrangements that when he returned he felt injustice to them that he ought to go on. The presidency was not a thing to be sought for, neither was it a thing to be refused. He never sought position, but when it came to him, if he felt it his duty to accept if he could fill the place. He was also incapable of supposing his friends to be selfish. Well, however, Grant may not have been entirely innocent of desiring a third term. His international travels filled him with foreign policy ideas, including new trade agreements and closer relations with Japan and China. He also deplored Southern Democrats' increasingly successful efforts to undo Reconstruction and believed he was the only Republican who could win in the South. His public appearances throughout the South on his way to visit Mexico looked like a campaign tour, and Julia was excited about returning to the White House.
Well, the efforts of Grant's supporters positioned him as the frontrunner heading into the June 1880 Republican Convention. However, some Republicans remained unenthusiastic about a Grant third term. They remembered his administration's many corruption scandals and, believing civil service reform was a winning issue with voters, felt the party could not afford to embrace a candidate so nakedly beholden to the spoil system machine. Conkling placed Grant's name in nomination, saying, quote, when asked which state he hails from, our sole reply shall be, he hails from Appomattox and its famous apple tree. On the first ballot, Grant received 304 votes against 284 for Maine Senator James G. Blaine and 93 for Treasury Secretary and former Ohio Senator John Sherman. No candidate had a majority of all the delegates, and the convention remained deadlocked, with the top three candidates holding on to their support for over 30 ballots.
On the 34th ballot, 16 Wisconsin delegates voted for Ohio Representative James A. Garfield, who raised a point of order to object as he had not consented to his name being in nomination. On the 35th ballot, Garfield was up to 50 votes, and on the 36th ballot, almost all of Blaine and Sherman supporters switched to Garfield, who won the nomination with 399 votes against 306 for Grant. As a consolation to the stalwarts, the vice presidential nomination was offered to Chester Arthur, who accepted the nomination against Conkling's advice. Grant said, quote, I can't say I regret my own defeat. By it I shall escape 4 years of hard work and 4 years of abuse. Grant campaigned for Garfield, who narrowly prevailed over the Democratic nominee Winfield Scott Hancock. But when President Garfield refused to cater to Conkling's patronage preferences, Grant pronounced himself, quote, completely disgusted with Garfield and lambasted him as, quote, a man without backbone, a man of fine ability, but lacking stamina.
There it is.
Not easy for a former president to make his way back into the White House.
That's for sure. And that's going to bring us to the top 5 non-consecutive term campaigns.
Number 3.
Theodore Roosevelt, 1912. Well, TR ascended to the presidency in 1900 upon William McKinley's assassination. After winning a term in his own right in 1904, he announced that he considered the 3.5 years he spent finishing McKinley's term to be his own first term. He said, quote, the wise custom which limits the president to 2 terms regards the substance and not the form. Under no circumstances will I be a candidate for or accept another nomination. He resisted entreaties to run in the 1908 election, which was won by his hand-picked successor and closest advisor, War Secretary William Howard Taft. Still only 50 years old, TR left office and spent more than a year abroad on an epic African safari.
Well, by the time he returned to the U.S., TR was hearing from progressive Republicans who felt alienated by Taft and who urged TR to challenge Taft for party leadership. TR had become more radically progressive toward the end of his presidency, and he now began to see Taft as a tool of the conservative political machine. He gave a major speech promoting a progressive program he called New Nationalism, which favored labor over capital, strict regulation of corporations, and assailed the independent judiciary for allegedly thwarting the will of the people, a position which appalled once and future Judge Taft. TR successfully challenged Taft's Vice President James Sherman for chairmanship of the 1910 New York State Republican Convention. In 1911, he wrote editorials criticizing Taft-supported treaty proposals for settling international disputes by arbitration, and he argued that Taft's trust-busting efforts were inferior to his own. In November 1911, a group of Ohio Republicans led by James R. Garfield, TR's Interior Secretary, who had been replaced by Taft, they endorsed TR for president. TR now reinterpreted the two-term tradition he had previously supported to apply only to an incumbent seeking a consecutive third term. In February 1912, he said, quote, "I will accept the nomination for president if it is tendered to me," and declared, "My hat is in the ring."
There you have it. Now, 1912 saw the first widespread primary elections, which were held in about one-third of the states. TR won most of the primary states, but Taft amassed delegates through party conventions in non-primary states. At the Republican National Convention, TR tried to challenge the credentials of many Taft delegates, arguing that they had been obtained by fraud, corruption, or bribery, although some of TR's own delegates had been garnered by questionable means. Taft supporters controlled the convention and managed to throw out most of TR's challenges, resulting in a Taft majority sufficient to win the nomination on the first ballot. TR's supporters then bolted the Republican Party, adjourning to a separate location where TR agreed to accept the presidential nomination of a third-party progressive party. When TR said, quote, "I'm feeling like a bull moose," cartoonists seized on the image, and the party became popularly known as the Bull Moose Party.
Well, the new Progressive Party held a national convention and fielded a full slate of candidates for offices throughout the country. However, TR's progressive appeal was undercut when Democrats nominated the progressive Woodrow Wilson for president. TR admitted in a letter to his son, quote, "Of course I do not for a moment believe that we shall win." But he felt compelled to avenge what he saw as a corrupt Republican convention and to avoid disappointing his own supporters. He knew that he would not beat Wilson, backed by a united and well-funded Democratic Party, but he hoped to at least beat Taft. He embarked on an aggressive campaign tour, knowing that neither the professorial Wilson nor the long-winded Taft could match his energetic speaking style.
On October 12th, TR was on his way to a speech in Milwaukee when he stopped to acknowledge a cheering crowd outside his hotel. Amongst the crowd was John Schrank, a delusional Bavarian immigrant who later claimed he had a dream in which he was visited by the ghost of William McKinley, who told him to avenge his assassination and pointed to a picture of TR. From 7 feet away, Schrank shot TR with a .38 caliber Colt revolver. The bullet lodged in TR's chest muscle after hitting his steel eyeglass case and a folded copy of his 50-page speech, which were in his breast pocket. TR knew that since he was not coughing blood, the bullet had not reached his lungs. He refused to go to the hospital and proceeded to deliver the speech as planned, speaking for over 80 minutes as blood seeped into his shirt, telling the crowd, quote, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." He went to the hospital after the speech, and doctors determined that it would be more dangerous to try to remove the bullet, so he carried it in his chest muscle the rest of his life. Schrank earned the number 2 spot on our list of the top 5 failed assassins.
On Election Day, Woodrow Wilson won the presidency with 435 electoral votes against 88 for TR and just 8 for Taft. Wilson won 42% of the popular vote against 27% for TR, 23% for Taft, and 6% for socialist candidate Eugene V. Debs. Though Wilson won 40 states, in only 13 southern states did he poll better than TR and Taft's combined total. TR won the states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Minnesota, California, South Dakota, and Washington, while Taft won only Utah and Vermont. TR's 88 electoral votes are the most ever won by a third-party candidate. On election night, TR called Wilson to congratulate him and told reporters, quote, "Like all other good citizens, I accept the result with good humor and contentment."
That's just it. And that's going to lead us to an honorable mention for Theodore Roosevelt for 1916 and 1920. As the 1916 election approached, TR hoped to win a joint nomination from both the Republican and Progressive parties, but conservative Republicans still held a grudge against him for causing the 1912 party schism, and his warlike rhetoric did not play well to an electorate that still favored American neutrality in the First World War. TR landed in 7th place on the first ballot at the 1916 Republican Convention, which nominated former New York Governor and current Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes. The Progressive Convention nominated TR, but he refused the nomination and endorsed Hughes. Hughes lost to Wilson, but after Democrats lost both houses of Congress in the 1918 midterm elections, TR's supporters believed the field was clear for him to win a joint Republican-Progressive nomination in 1920. However, TR was devastated by the death of his son Quentin in the war, and his own health was declining. Regarding another presidential run, TR said, quote, "I am indifferent on the subject. Since Quentin's death, the world seems to have shut down upon me. He suffered a heart attack and died on January 6, 1919.
Wow. The great TR shuffling off this mortal coil.
Indeed.
Just before he might have finally won that coveted non-consecutive term.
That's just it. And that's going to bring us to the top 5 non-consecutive term campaigns.
Number 2.
Grover Cleveland, 1892.
Well, in 1884, New York Governor Grover Cleveland became the first Democrat to win the presidency since before the Civil War, edging out Republican James G. Blaine in the critical swing states of New York and Indiana. In 1888, Cleveland's re-election effort faced a strong challenge from the Republican nominee, former Indiana Senator Benjamin Harrison. Cleveland won the popular vote, but Harrison narrowly prevailed in New York and Indiana, clinching the Electoral College. When leaving the White House on Harrison's inauguration day, First Lady Frances Cleveland told a staff member, quote, "I want you to take good care of all the furniture and ornaments in the house, for I want to find everything just as it is now when we come back again." Asked when she would return, she responded, quote, "We are coming back 4 years from today."
A prophetic statement from Francis Cleveland. Cleveland himself had no intention of returning. He wrote to a friend, quote, "You cannot imagine the relief which has come to me with the termination of my official term. I feel I am fast seeking the place I desire to reach, the place of a respectable private citizen." The following year, he told an aide, quote, "Why should I have any desire or purpose to return to the presidency? It involves a responsibility almost beyond human strength for a man who brings conscience to the discharge of his duties. Besides, I feel somehow that I made a creditable showing during my first term, all things considered, and I might lose whatever of character and reputation are already gained in it."
Cleveland resumed his law practice, spent a lot of time fishing, and had his first child with his young wife. He stayed out of politics, but he became dismayed at the Harrison administration's reversal of his policies. Cleveland favored lowering tariffs. Harrison signed the McKinley Tariff, raising rates to their highest levels yet. Cleveland favored the gold standard. Harrison signed a compromise bill expanding silver currency. Cleveland vetoed numerous attempts to expand veterans' pensions. Harrison signed a new pension bill that exploded the federal budget. Cleveland favored decreased federal spending. The new Republican Congress spent more money than ever before, becoming known as the Billion-Dollar Congress. Cleveland told a friend, quote, "I feel badly and sad to see the result of so much hard labor undone, and yet I sometimes think that God has ordered it all for the enlightenment and awakening of our people."
Well, Cleveland would receive some vindication when Democrats won the 1890 midterm elections, retaking control of the House of Representatives. In February 1891, Cleveland issued a public letter reaffirming his opposition to silver currency, saying, quote, "I am supposed to be a leader of my party. If any word of mine can check these dangerous fallacies, it is my duty to give that word, whatever the cost may be to me." Some Cleveland advisors thought the quote-unquote silver letter was political suicide given silver's increasing popularity, but Cleveland was always happy to sacrifice popularity by taking a principled stand. He hoped the Democratic Party would find a worthy successor to himself, but he began to reconsider retirement when it looked like the next nominee would be New York Governor David Hill, a Tammany Hall machine politician.
Well, in 1888, Cleveland had declined to endorse Hill for re-election to the governorship, and his clash with Tammany was instrumental in his losing New York to Harrison. Cleveland saw Hill as an unprincipled man who was willing to support high tariffs and silver currency to win votes. Cleveland allowed his supporters to begin building a nationwide network of grassroots support by working outside the traditional party organization. His quiet but effective campaign managers launched a PR offensive reminding voters why they liked the principled Cleveland. Meanwhile, Hill's campaign became seen as crassly political, particularly in its efforts to rig the New York State Convention into choosing pro-Hill delegates. And at the Democratic National Convention, Cleveland won the nomination on the first ballot, receiving 617 votes against 114 for Hill and 103 for Iowa Governor Horace Boyes. For vice president, the convention nominated a pro-silver candidate, Adlai Stevenson of Illinois.
The Republican convention renominated President Benjamin Harrison on the first ballot, but only after the failure of an attempt to replace him with Secretary of State James G. Blaine, the party's 1884 nominee. Harrison had lost favor among both Republican machine bosses and civil service reformers. There was also a major third-party challenge from the Populist Party made up of pro-silver farmers who despised the railroads and Wall Street bankers, which had won 8 seats in the House of Representatives in 1890. It nominated former Union General James Weaver for president and had a lot of support in western states, where some Democrats supported the populist ticket to block Republicans. Harrison's campaign was further hampered by the seriously declining health of First Lady Caroline Harrison, which prevented Harrison from campaigning. She would die in late October. Cleveland didn't do so much personal campaigning either, giving only one major speech at Madison Square Garden. He spent much of the summer fishing, but Adlai Stevenson led an energetic and well-funded Democratic campaign. Cleveland also met with the Tammany machine bosses, and though he did not bend to their demands to control federal patronage in New York, they reluctantly agreed to support the Democratic ticket.
On Election Day, Cleveland won a clear victory. He took both the major swing states of New York and Indiana, and he also captured Republican-leaning Illinois, Wisconsin, and California. He won 277 electoral votes against 145 for Harrison and 22 for Weaver, who won 4 western states and got 8.5% of the popular vote. Cleveland won the popular vote for the 3rd consecutive election. That feat was previously achieved only by Andrew Jackson and would later be matched and exceeded by FDR, who won it 4 consecutive times. Francis Cleveland's words indeed proved prophetic, as Grover Cleveland became the first ex-president to be elected to a non-consecutive term. But he wouldn't be the last.
That's right, and that's going to bring us to the top 5 non-consecutive presidential term campaigns.
Number 1.
Donald Trump. Well, President Donald Trump lost the 2020 election to Joe Biden, becoming the first incumbent since George H.W. Bush to lose his re-election bid. The final results had Biden ahead of Trump in the popular vote 81 million to 74 million, and in the Electoral College 306 to 232, winning 6 out of 7 key swing states. However, Trump refused to concede, alleging Biden had benefited from widespread fraud. After Trump's campaign lost post-election lawsuits in several swing states, the electors of the Electoral College met in each state capital on December 21st, 2020, and formalized Biden's Electoral College victory.
On January 6th, 2021, Congress was set to count and certify the Electoral College results after Trump reiterated his fraud claims at a Washington, D.C. rally. A mob of his supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol building. A later report issued by the Biden administration indicated between 2,000 and 2,500 people entered the Capitol, 174 police officers were assaulted, and one rioter was killed by police. Over 1,500 people, including Trump himself, would face criminal charges. On January 13th, the House of Representatives impeached Trump for, quote, incitement of insurrection, but the Senate would acquit him in February after he left office. On January 20th, Trump joined Presidents John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson in his refusal to attend his successor's inauguration. Just as a side note, at Benjamin Harrison's rainy inauguration in 1889, Grover Cleveland graciously held an umbrella over Harrison's head. Times have changed.
Indeed. Trump reportedly began considering another presidential run immediately after Election Day 2020. On November 15th, 2022, he officially announced his candidacy, saying, "The journey ahead of us will not be easy. Anyone who truly seeks to take on this rigged and corrupt system will be faced with a storm of fire that only a few could understand." He indeed faced a firestorm of legal troubles. In March 2023, he was indicted on New York State criminal charges for allegedly falsifying business records to conceal an alleged hush money payment to porn star Stormy Daniels in 2016. Side note, check out our top 5 presidential adulterers. Number 4, Donald Trump. In May 2024, he was convicted of 34 felonies, but after the 2024 election, he was sentenced to unconditional discharge. No punishment.
Well, in June 2023, Trump was indicted on federal criminal charges for allegedly mishandling classified documents found when the FBI raided his home at Mar-a-Lago. In August 2023, he was indicted on federal charges for allegedly illegally conspiring to overturn the 2020 election. In August 2024, a judge dismissed the classified documents case, and after the 2024 election, the special prosecutor withdrew the federal election case and abandoned his appeal in the documents case. In August 2023, Trump was indicted on Georgia state charges for allegedly attempting to overturn the election. After the 2024 election, a Georgia appeals court disqualified the prosecutor from handling the case due to a, quote, appearance of impropriety, and it remains unclear whether that case will ever move forward.
Trump also faced New York civil suits for sexual assault and defamation. He was found liable in both and ordered to pay almost $90 million in damages, though his appeals in both cases remain pending as of this recording. Finally, he faced a Colorado lawsuit to keep him off the presidential ballot under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which bars those who have, quote, engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States from holding federal office. Colorado courts held Trump wasn't ineligible to appear on the ballot, but the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously reversed the Colorado ruling.
Well, in addition to his legal troubles, Trump faced a host of challengers for the Republican nomination, including Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, Chris Christie, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Mike Pence. Trump declined to participate in debates with the other candidates, but he maintained a clear lead in opinion polls after he won the Iowa caucuses on January 15, 2024. All other candidates except Nikki Haley dropped out. Haley won the Vermont and Washington, D.C. primaries, but Trump won the other 49 states, becoming the first former president since Cleveland to secure a major party nomination. Meanwhile, Biden won all of the Democratic primaries without facing a major challenger. Nevertheless, Biden suffered from low approval ratings, with many potential voters blaming him for a sluggish economy, high inflation, a botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, and a lack of leadership in resolving the Russia-Ukraine and Israel-Hamas wars. The oldest president in American history, he also faced questions regarding his age and mental capacity.
That's it. On June 27, 2024, Trump and Biden engaged in perhaps the most consequential debate in presidential debate history. They each called the other the worst president of all time and argued over who was the better golfer. Side note, check out our top 5 presidential golfers. Number 1, Donald Trump. Joe Biden, not mentioned. But the consequential factor was Biden's disastrous display of cognitive decline. According to the failing New York Times, quote, Mr. Should I keep that? Quote, Mr. Biden's allies desperately hoped he could turn in a commanding performance to calm voters' persistent concerns about his age. That dream died within minutes. A raspy Mr. Biden grasped to recall some specifics and labored to articulate the statistics he could remember. In one early answer, he confused trillionaires with billionaires. Sometimes he lost his train of thought entirely.
Well, regarding health care, Biden said, quote, we'd be able to help make sure that all those things we need to do, child care, elder care, making sure that we continue to strengthen our healthcare system, making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what we've been able to do with the COVID, with dealing with everything we have to do with, look, if we finally beat Medicare on the issue of abortion, Biden said, quote, here's the deal. There's a lot of young women who are being raped by their in-laws, by their spouses, brothers and sisters, it's just ridiculous, and they can do nothing about it.
Well, after the debate, some Republican congressmen called for Vice President Kamala Harris to invoke the 25th Amendment and have Biden deemed unfit to remain in office. Many Democratic congressmen and big money donors called for Biden to drop out of the race, as did many major liberal newspapers, including the aforementioned New York Times and the equally failing Washington Post. Biden refused. In a televised interview, he admitted he had a, quote, bad night at the debate, but argued he's, quote, still in good shape, and said only the Lord Almighty could make him drop out.
On July 13th, 2024, Trump spoke at a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. In a shocking security lapse, 20-year-old Thomas Matthew Crooks made his way onto a rooftop 130 yards away from Trump and was able to fire 8 rounds from an AR-15 style rifle before Secret Service snipers eliminated him. Crooks's first shot grazed Trump's right ear and would have been a fatal headshot had Trump not turned his head to look at an immigration statistics chart. One audience member was killed by the gunfire and 2 others were wounded. Trump quickly dropped for cover and Secret Service agents swarmed him. As agents ushered him off stage with blood on his face, he pumped his fist and chanted, quote, fight, fight, fight. As of this recording, the assassination attempt is still under investigation and Crooks's motives remain unclear. Nevertheless, we hereby officially update our list of the top 5 failed assassins to slot him in at number 2.5, just behind the aforementioned number 2, John Schrank, and just ahead of number 3, Richard Lawrence, who had both of his pistols misfire when he tried to shoot Andrew Jackson in 1835. John Hinckley, if you're out there listening, you're still number 1.
Well, days after the assassination attempt, Trump named Ohio Senator J.D. Vance as his running mate. In his Republican National Convention speech, Trump said, I stand before you in this arena only by the grace of Almighty God. I'm not supposed to be here tonight. On July 21st, under intense and unrelenting pressure from top Democratic donors and party leaders, Biden withdrew from the race, becoming the first incumbent since Lyndon Johnson not to stand for re-election. Biden endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris, and on August 5th, with near unanimity, delegates to the Democratic National Convention nominated Harris for president. Harris chose Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her running mate.
During the campaign, Trump would describe Harris as
lazy as hell, dumb as a rock, a radical left lunatic, a shit vice president,
and
The worst vice president in the history of our country.
Our listeners will recall that Harris was not on our list of the top 5 worst vice presidents, but it remains to be seen if she'll make our upcoming top 5 shit vice presidents. Harris described Trump as, quote, dangerous, a threat to democracy, increasingly unhinged and unstable, and a fascist. At a debate with Harris, Trump said,
I probably took a bullet to the head because of the things that they say about me. They talk about democracy. I'm a threat to democracy. They're the threat to democracy.
In late August, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., whom the Biden campaign had derided as an anti-vax conspiracy theorist and who dropped out of the Democratic race before the primaries to run as an independent, ended his campaign and endorsed Trump.
Then, on September 15th, Trump was golfing at his course in Palm Beach, Florida, when a Secret Service agent spotted a man hiding in the bushes behind a fence surrounding the course, aiming a rifle at the agent. The agent fired at the suspect, who fled, but was soon apprehended and identified as 58-year-old Ryan Wesley Ruth. Currently awaiting trial on charges of attempting to assassinate a presidential candidate, Ruth had previously been reported to the FBI and Interpol for erratic behavior while trying to volunteer to fight for Ukraine in its war against Russia. His assassination attempt was so pathetic that we declined to update our top 5 failed assassins to even make him an honorable mention.
As Election Day approached, polls showed Trump and Harris neck and neck. On October 20th, Trump served fries during a campaign stop at a Pennsylvania McDonald's where he claimed Harris had lied about working at McDonald's when she was in college. On October 27th, at a Madison Square Garden Trump rally, comedian Tony Hinchcliffe made a joke describing Puerto Rico as, quote, a floating island of garbage. Democrats attempted to make hay from the allegedly offensive joke until Biden seemed to call Trump's supporters garbage when he said, quote, the only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters. Trump responded by showing up to a rally in a garbage truck and appearing on stage in a reflective vest.
Making himself a perfect target for another assassination attempt.
During the campaign's final weeks, Trump and Vance each appeared on the popular podcasts of Joe Rogan and Theo Vaughn, which reportedly helped their campaign reach young male voters, a demographic that would prove a key component of their electoral coalition. Harris declined to appear on Rogan's podcast due to, quote, backlash from her own staff, and she instead appeared at a rally with Beyoncé, who disappointed rallygoers by not performing any music.
Well, on Election Day, Trump won a decisive victory, capturing all 7 swing states and winning the Electoral College 312 to 226. He also won the popular vote with 77 million votes against 75 million for Harris. On January 20th, 2025, the 45th president was sworn in as the 47th president.
Wow. A historic election.
Indeed. And we got a couple honorable mentions here, beginning with Millard Fillmore in 1856.
That's right. As a member of the Whig Party, Millard Fillmore became vice president after he and Zachary Taylor won the 1848 election, and he became president in July 1850 after Taylor shit himself to death. He sought the Whig nomination for president in 1852, but a challenge from his friend, Secretary of State Daniel Webster, divided his support and enabled Winfield Scott to win the nomination. Scott was trounced by Democrat Franklin Pierce. From March 1855 to June 1856, Fillmore traveled through Europe and the Middle East. By the time he returned to the United States, he had won his party's presidential nomination.
That's right. Not the Whig Party, which collapsed in 1854 when the Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed further expansion of slavery. Anti-slavery Whigs and Democrats joined with members of the Free Soil and Liberty parties to form the new Republican Party. Another party that rose from the ashes of the Whigs was the American Party, also known as the Know Nothing Party, a populist movement centered on working-class men and farmers that was suspicious of the moneyed elite and harbored anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic sentiments. The party enjoyed considerable success in the 1854 elections, winning 51 seats in the House of Representatives, more than the remnant of the Whig Party.
In 1855, Fillmore published a letter warning against immigrant influence in elections and joined the Know Nothing Party. In February 1856, the Know Nothing Convention nominated him for president, with Andrew Jackson Donaldson, Old Hickory's nephew, as his running mate. Upon his return to the U.S., Fillmore received a huge reception in New York City and spoke at similar receptions as he made his way back to Buffalo, warning that electing the Republican candidate, California Senator John C. Fremont, would divide the Union and lead to civil war. He agreed with the Democratic candidate James Buchanan that slavery was a matter for the states. He rarely spoke about his party's nativist beliefs and focused on the need to preserve the Union, saying that the Know-Nothings were, quote, the only hope of forming a truly national party which shall ignore this constant and distracting agitation of slavery. Many voters who may have favored Fillmore voted for Buchanan for fear of splitting the vote and letting the Republican win.
That's right. On Election Day, Fillmore received 21.6% of the popular vote and finished third behind Buchanan's 45% and Fremont's 33%. He won the state of Maryland and received its 8 electoral votes. The Know Nothing Party declined sharply after 1856, as its own membership was bitterly divided on slavery, and it had only managed to nominate Fillmore after its more anti-slavery element had bolted the convention.
So much for a party built on ignoring slavery.
That's it.
Well, that's going to bring us to our final honorable mention, which is Herbert Hoover, from both 1936 and 1940. Back on Election Day 1932, at the lowest depth of the Great Depression, President Herbert Hoover was crushed by Franklin D. Roosevelt. FDR's campaign succeeded in blaming Hoover for the Depression, and FDR's administration would continue to lambaste him, portraying the New Deal as a contrast to Hoover's supposedly failed policies. Hoover became extremely critical of the New Deal, noting that its massive expansion of federal power and government intervention in the economy was, quote, a muddle of uncoordinated and reckless adventures that nevertheless failed to end the Depression.
And in 1936, Hoover hoped to win the Republican presidential nomination and, without overtly declaring his candidacy, gave many speeches intended to promote his availability. But the Republican Party was ready to move on. Hoover was invited to give a speech at the Republican National Convention, which was well received, but Kansas Governor Alf Landon won the nomination on the first ballot, and Hoover got no support. Landon declined to have Hoover campaign on his behalf. Hoover continued to criticize FDR's administration. Expecting FDR to retire after 2 terms, Hoover sought the Republican nomination again in 1940. He again failed to gain any traction, finishing in 9th place on the first convention ballot. The nominee, Wendell Willkie, declined to have Hoover campaign on his behalf. Well, there you have it, listeners. The top 5 non-consecutive term campaigns.
Couple successful ones, most going down in ignominious failure.
That's it. But such is life.
One thing that's always a guaranteed success, the Dead Presidents Podcast.
That's just it. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Thanks for listening.